Dr. Nikole Hannah-Jones, you are somebody that I feel like has really opened like a portal for a lot of folks into, and not just Black folks, but just like into the truth, right? And as we are in a time that seems to just be so dedicated to like, nah, shut up. And nah, don't learn that. And like when I saw Florida was banning dictionaries, that's when I was like, oh, y'all are on a different level of commitment to ignorance, you know?
Yes.
And it's bonkers to me. I think for a lot of folks, they may think that you're just like a historian or a professor, but ultimately you refer to yourself as a journalist. And
I am a journalist.
Right. But I think people don't understand the concept of journalism as being able to be historical and, you know, as a space for teaching, et cetera, because I think, especially in the current climate, we just don't see a lot of it. We really kind of see people claiming to be journalists. I mean, you could be a journalist on TikTok now. I don't know if you know this. I don't know if you know
I
this.
mean, you could be a legitimate journalist on TikTok. Many are not, and we need to be much more discerning of, you know, where we get our information from and our sources. But, you know, to be clear, so since we're talking about truth, I'm not a doctor. I only have honorary doctorates. I don't have a real one that I earned.
Touché.
And my primary job is I'm a writer at the New York Times. So I am a journalist. I've been a journalist 20 years. I just have always loved history. My first degrees are in history and African American studies. And I really feel that you cannot practice journalism if you're not historically informed. That how do you write about any of the things we're seeing in our society, but particularly race and politics, if you don't understand the history of our country and what built them? So I am a journalist. People get confused because I spend a lot of time in history, but my real job is the New York Times. That's what I do.
And as far as the space of journalism as it exists right now, like how would you consider the climate to be different than when you got into the field, if at all?
I mean, in some ways, it's very much the same. Not diverse enough. Newsrooms are not reflective of the multiracial democracy that we have. Newsrooms often take diversity as optional, or, you know, something extra you can do if you have money to do it, and not as a necessity. Diverse newsrooms mean our report is more accurate, that our report actually reflects what's happening in our country and in real people's lives. It actually holds up to me our highest mandate, which is to hold power accountable and to speak on behalf of the vulnerable. And I think we clearly still struggle with that. I think what's different now is we do have Black journalists in positions that you didn't really see when I first started out 20 years ago. We have a tremendous megaphone to do you know, groundbreaking reporting and reporting like the 1619 Project. But we're also, in some ways, fundamentally more broken than we were when I started. There are so many fewer journalism jobs. Local journalism has really been gutted. We're seeing local news organizations shuttering. So I think the American population is at once inundated with information in ways we haven't seen, but they also don't know what's good information.
Yes.
What's vetted information, what's an accurate source of information. And I think we have totally failed to understand, how does one cover the Trump era? How does one, you know, we are indoctrinated as journalists into this idea of objectivity, but how does one have balance when you have one political party that's gone completely rogue, that is explicitly saying, actually, if democracy is multiracial, we don't want it.
Straight up.
And I don't think we have figured out how to cover Trump. I don't think we've figured out how to cover in America where democracy, even for white people, is not secure. I mean, you know, democracy for Black people has never been secure.
Right.
But where even white people may lose the democracy they have. And I just don't think we figured that out at all. And news in some ways is broken.
I feel like at this point, people have oftentimes through their journalistic platforms bastardize objectivity to become both sidesism.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you were going to have something to say about that, but you just co-signed it. All right, cool.
Oh,
Next
I do.
question.
I mean, so one, let me be clear. I've never believed in objectivity. I don't think it's possible.
Okay.
Because objectivity means you don't have an opinion on what you're covering. You're neutral. I don't think it's possible for human beings to be neutral. I actually, even though I've worked in mainstream media my entire career or legacy white media, I see myself in the tradition of the Black press. That's why I say journalism to me is activism. Journalism is not a neutral profession. You know, the Washington Post, the motto of the Washington Post is democracy dies in darkness.
Yep.
That's not neutral, right? That's a stated
Touché.
position that democracy matters and that our job as journalists is to protect democracy. So I think, you know, this idea of objectivity in news is very recent. Prior to really the 1960s, 1970s, most newspapers had a kind of stated point of view. The New York Times was founded as a Republican newspaper. Republicans, you know, before the switch, as the anti-slavery party Republicans. And so you had an understanding that people who report news are human beings and they have opinions on things. I think what I strive for, what I think journalistically we have to have is objectivity of method. So I'm not pretending when I write about race, I don't have stakes in this, that I don't have opinions on this, that if I'm writing about school segregation, it's clearly because I think school segregation is wrong and we should do better for our kids. But my method has to be objective. Am I being fair? Are my facts correct? Am I accurately representing the different perspectives? But not with, as you said, this both sidism. I'm not going to represent those who want inequality as having, you know,
a valid point of view. Yeah.
As those who don't. I will reflect their point of view. But what we've run into, we saw this with climate change, though we've corrected on that, where even though 10% of scientists were climate change deniers, we would give them even weight in a story to make it seem like we were being balanced. So now we struggle, of course, with that when we're covering politics. We feel like if we write something that looks negative about Republicans, we have to balance that out with something that looks negative about Democrats, when these two things are no longer the same. So that's really what I push back against. And most journalists of color that I know have never pretended to believe in objectivity. The difference is we're much more honest, where many of my white journalistic colleagues pretend to be objective, but you and I can look at the coverage on any given day and not believe that it's objective for a second.
I feel like there's a lot of people, myself included, who have, you know, had to look at the career that we stepped into and then had to reformulate it once we got in the mix. And it's like we still want to do this thing, but we realize that the space in which we're doing it, now that we're in it, is different than maybe what we thought of when we were an outsider. Do you feel like you had that experience, or did you know going in, like, I'm going to be in here kung fu fighting?
Yeah, I don't feel like I didn't have to be disabused of any kind of idealism about the profession. I study race for a living. I knew going in that the types of stories I wanted to cover would be a challenge to cover them, because that's what drove me to be a journalist in the first place, was looking at the way my communities, Black communities, were being covered in mainstream media and saying that doesn't reflect the reality that I see. What I did have to adjust to is how hard it would be, even when people hired you, understanding the type of journalism you wanted to do, that they liked the idea of it. They liked phenotype diversity. So they like to be able to say, we hired a Black reporter, but they don't want that Black reporter reporting from a Black perspective. And that definitely was a struggle throughout my career.
Are you invested in this? I am invested in this conversation. This is like one of them articles where you start to read it and you're like, I gotta keep reading it because you need more. Well, if you want more, then let me tell you what to do. Go on over to my Patreon, Amanda Seales, or go to theamandaverse.com. Either route will get you where you need to be to see the full extent of this interview. Yes, come and join us at the Seal Squad.